Good afternoon, everyone. Today is Monday, June 1st, 2020 at 4:45 p.m. Eastern Time. We're going to get right into it today. Judge Sullivan has filed in court against, at the direction of the judges in the appeals court. This video today is brought to you by Noble Gold. Big thanks to Noble Gold for sponsoring the show all the time. There's a lot of despair around, sleepless nights, lots of upheaval going on right now. Stock market is returning -10 since the start of the year. It looks pretty dismal, but it doesn't have to be, guys. Gold has actually gained ground by around 15%, which is 25% more bang for your buck. It's probably something you haven't considered before. However, these things are important, and so is investing in precious metals. Gold, silver, palladium, and platinum have proven to be safe investments. It is the only investment with appreciating value during economic collapse. So if you're interested in securing your wealth, call Noble Gold Investment at 877-646-5347. That's 877-646-5347. Or you can visit noblegoldinvestments.com and make sure you let them know that Tracy Beans sent you. Someone saying that I interrupted them listening to the podcast. Sorry about that, guys. Just bringing in my DLive, Periscope, and Facebook friends. It's been crazy times, guys. Crazy, crazy times. Sorry to interrupt. The podcast today was super, super crazy. Very emotional. Very passionate. We vented. And I think that a lot of you guys will find it cathartic. It's a good word. Hey, Vicky. All right, so this is going to be a little bit of a longer video because we're going to dissect this filing by Sullivan's attorney and in the Court of Appeals here. And I started reading it, and I immediately saw it for what it was, which is what we talked about on, I think it was Saturday, when we went over the Friends of the Court filing in the original docket. And it is that the upside-down gymnastics that are gone through here to try and prove some point are crazy. I'm not an attorney. I always say that. I'm just going to go through this using my experience and what I've studied and what I've learned, and the obvious, which is pretty, it'll be pretty obvious to you too. So Beth Wilkinson and Costa Stolj, whoever these people are, filed this, counsel for Judge Sullivan. There's the table of contents, blah, 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 blah. I'm going to be honest, I haven't read this entire thing yet, but I got agitated enough that I thought that I would go through this with you guys live. And there are other attorneys out there who can say that I'm wrong or whatever. I don't know, but I'm just telling you, I haven't been wrong very often, so I feel comfortable going through this. Here we go. Introduction. This is Sullivan. The unique facts of this case warrant evaluation by the trial judge before any review by this court. So it starts off by scolding the appellate court. It starts off by scolding them. It is unusual for a criminal defendant. It is unusual for a criminal defendant to claim innocence and move to withdraw his guilty plea after repeatedly swearing under oath that he committed the crime. Twice he did that. It is unprecedented for an acting U.S. attorney to contradict the solemn representations that career prosecutors made time and again and undermine the district court's legal and factual findings in moving on his own to dismiss the charge years after two different federal judges accepted the defendant's plea. That is basically saying the DOJ is at fault here in some way or is acting inappropriately. And what they're asserting, even here just in the first paragraph, is quite alarming. These reversals presented Judge Sullivan with several substantial questions. Was he required to grant the government's post-plea motion to dismiss and reverse his findings that Mr. Flynn's false statements to the FBI about his contacts with Russia were material without any inquiry into the facts set forth in and surrounding the government's filing? He didn't find anything. Now, I think that they're asserting this because he accepted the plea, that's his findings. There have been new revelations in this case that the government acted inappropriately and they take responsibility for that. This is ridiculous. What implications would dismissal have on Mr. Flynn's separate false statements to the Department of Justice about his work for Turkey, which were part of his plea agreement but not addressed in the government's motion? His work for Turkey? This completely ignores the Rafikian case, which was overturned by a judge in this same circuit. The verdict, the criminal guilty verdict was overturned because the government didn't prove their case. And there is severe ethical concerns and conflict of interest issues at stake here in terms of the supposed FARA violations. The fact that they even brought this up shows you they're partisan hacks. I mean, I've talked about the FARA case over and over and what happened in that case. The FBI's own, a forensic investigator for the FBI was unable to prove any ties to Turkey. I mean, this is just something else. Do the facts here provide reason to question the presumption of regularity that ordinarily attaches to prosecutorial decisions? And they cite Fokker, which is the case that establishes the precedent against what they're trying to do. And then they say, and what, if anything, should Judge Sullivan do about Mr. Flynn's sworn statements to the court, where he repeatedly admitted to the crime and to the voluntariness of his guilty plea, only to now claim that he never lied to the government and was pressured and misled into pleading guilty? Listen, again, to assert that is ridiculous as well, because he was being advised to plead guilty under the guidance of the same counsel that conspired with the former U.S. attorney, who's no longer on the case, in a partisan witch hunt of a special counsel investigation that relayed itself on no facts or evidence whatsoever. It just tosses that aside. This is just bull. Because the parties before him now support the same relief, Judge Sullivan turned to an approach used by federal courts across the country, as well as district courts in this circuit. He appointed an amicus to present counter-arguments and set a briefing schedule, giving the government and Mr. Flynn the last word. BS. He turned the case into a circus because he doesn't like the fact that General Flynn won't be going to jail. That's what he did. The question before this court is whether it should short-circuit this process, forbid even a limited inquiry into the government's motion, and order that motion granted. There should be no limited inquiry into the motion. They are the prosecutors. They have constitutional authority. They're the ones that decide whether to charge or not. The court does not make those decisions. Constitutional separation of power dictate that Judge Sullivan cannot just decide that he is going to become the executive and the judicial branch at the same time. They say the answer is no, that all of what I just said should be ignored. Mandamus is an extraordinary remedy that should be denied where the district court has not actually decided anything. Here they're scolding the very court they're arguing in front of. They are scolding the appellate court right now for taking Mandamus on. Now, Mandamus being heard so quickly and in such a rapid time schedule is very rare. Very, very rare, exceedingly rare. And now this judge is saying to them, how dare you question me, basically. It's insane. The government's motion is pending before Judge Sullivan and could well be granted. He's saying, I could definitely grant it. Why? So Mr. Flynn can obtain the exact relief he seeks through ordinary judicial process. Moreover, Judge Sullivan's consideration of the government's motion is not clearly foreclosed by Rule 48 or this court's precedents. In other words, court, you're out of your league here, as would be required to justify Mandamus. The government's motion acknowledges that Rule 48 does not require Judge Sullivan to serve as a mere rubber stamp. And again, I'm going to stop here and say an aside. This is not what the appellate court asked Judge Sullivan to argue. They did not ask Judge Sullivan to argue whether or not they should take the case up as Mandamus. They ordered him to argue why he is not dismissing these charges. He's not even listening to what they're asking. He's filing his own argument outside of the scope of what they've asked. While this court observed in Fokker that separation of powers principles limit a judge's role in reviewing the government's charging decisions, it also explained that different separation of powers considerations may exist where the district court already accepted a plea and was proceeding to sentencing. Finally, the unusual facts of this case raise at least a plausible judicial question, anticipated by Fokker, whether the presumption of regularity for prosecutorial decisions is overcome. Mr. Flynn's case has garnered considerable attention, but that is no reason to resolve it outside of the normal judicial process. This is a, quote, court of review, not of first view. The questions presented should be resolved by the district court in the first instance. If Judge Sullivan's decision is anything short of what the parties sought, this court will have an opportunity to review it without writing on a blank slate. Because there is no reason for this court to enter the fray now, the petition should be denied. That is not an issue. They accepted the position. They accepted the petition. This judge does not get to argue with the appeals court whether they should accept something that is the very reason that they're responding to it. I hope that makes sense. It's a little bit confusing. They didn't ask him whether or not they should take this case on. They asked him to respond to why he's doing this asinine, back-ass words, completely unconstitutional, ridiculous politicization in not accepting the Department of Justice, the executive branch's decision to no longer charge General Flynn. This argument, as we are going to go through it, is so weak and so flimsy. I really am anticipating a complete and total shutdown here. But I've been anticipating things for a long time, and sometimes things just don't go the way we think they will. So, the factual background goes through the case here. They assert that he lied, even though there has been evidence that has come out that he did not lie. They assert that he lied a bunch of times. I'm not going to go through this entire thing. They talk about Contreras, this is actually, I take that back. I need to do this. I need to go through it because there's so much in here that just drives me insane. Okay. On December 1st, 2017, Mr. Flynn waived indictment and pled guilty to a one-count criminal information charging him with making materially false statements in violation of 18 U.S.C. 1001. In conjunction with the plea, the government submitted a statement of offense to the district court. Like all the government's filings, this submission was made pursuant to the rules of professional conduct, which require accurate representations to the court. So that's great. This is basically saying, the judge is saying, because the government said so, it is inherently true. Well, guess what, guys? The government looked again, and it's not. And they came back to right the wrong. So he's basically saying by arguing this that he's just going to, the court should just, because there are rules in place, the government just blanketly follows them. Laura, just real quick, someone's saying Flynn's gag order continues. There is no gag order on General Flynn. He has no gag order. I'm just making sure that everybody knows that. The statement of offense recounted 3 sets of materially false statements. 2 involved lies Mr. Flynn told to the FBI in a January 24th, 2017 interview regarding his contacts with Russia and other countries regarding U.S. foreign policy. Full stop. He didn't lie. It's clear as day, especially now that we have these transcripts. It's clear as day. The remaining statements involved lies to the DOJ and documents Mr. Flynn filed on March 7, 2017 about work that he and his consulting firm did for Turkey. Mr. Flynn's plea agreement incorporated the statement of offense, and in consideration for his guilty plea, the prosecutors agreed not to charge him further for that conduct. End of story. End of story. End of story. In a section of the agreement binding only on the parties, it's so liberal the way they're doing this, so leftist. Mr. Flynn agreed to, quote, forego the right to any further discovery or disclosures of information not already provided at the time of his plea. Now Judge Sullivan is arguing against the very thing he has made a mandatory blanket order in every single case he's ever presided over, the Brady order. He is literally arguing himself District Judge Rudolph Contreras took his initial plea. Judge Contreras placed Mr. Flynn under oath, confirming his understanding that if you don't answer my questions truthfully, you could be prosecuted for perjury or making a false statement. Mr. Flynn then confirmed he had sufficient time to consult with his attorneys, who lied to him, and was satisfied with the services that they have provided. At this hearing, the government represented the basis for his charge. Among other things, they claimed that the defendant made material false statements and omissions during an interview with the FBI on January 24th regarding his interactions with Russia. It was the Russian ambassador. Just the mere way they present his conversations with Russia is a lie. They present it as though he's conspiring with random Russians hiding in basements somewhere. This attorney is disgusting. At the time of the interview, the FBI had an open investigation into Russia's efforts to interfere in the 2016 presidential election, and that on March 7th, 2017, the defendant filed multiple documents with the DOJ pertaining to a project performed by him and his company for the principal benefit of the Republic of Turkey. Untrue, unproven, not true. This was just a railroad job. Mr. Flynn agreed with the government's recitation and that he in fact did what the government had stated that it can prove at trial. Mr. Flynn then confirmed his guilt of making false statements in violation of 1001 after agreeing that he understood the proceedings and did not have any questions. In late 2018, the government and Mr. Flynn reaffirm his criminal conduct, and Judge Sullivan finds that Mr. Flynn made material false statements. Shortly after the entry of Mr. Flynn's guilty plea, the case was randomly reassigned to Judge Sullivan. I love the way they say that. Randomly reassigned. Yes, it was randomly reassigned. But the word randomly does not need to be included here. Thereafter, Judge Sullivan entered a standing order advising the government of its continuing obligation to provide exculpatory evidence to Mr. Flynn. Judge Sullivan presided over his first status hearing on July 10th, 2018, and made clear at the time of sentencing it was up to the parties and that he had no intention to micromanage what's going on with the parties in this case vis-a-vis cooperation. When the parties jointly reported that the case was ready for sentencing, Judge Sullivan referred it to the probation officer for pre-sentence investigation. A full year after Mr. Flynn originally pled guilty, the parties filed sentencing memoranda. The government's memorandum reiterated that Mr. Flynn's false statements were material, and Flynn did not take issue with the government's description of his offense. Again, they had no idea what was being hidden from them at this point, and he was being represented by conflicted counsel. But his memorandum contained additional facts regarding the circumstances of the FBI interview, alleged to be relevant to the court's consideration of a just punishment. As a result, the December 18th, 2018 sentencing turned into a second plea colloquy. As Judge Sullivan explained, the court takes its responsibility here today, as always, very seriously. Mr. Flynn's briefing concerned the court as he raised issues that may affect or call into question his guilty plea, and at the very least, maybe his acceptance of responsibility. As such, the court concludes it must now first ask Mr. Flynn certain questions to ensure he entered the plea knowingly, voluntarily, intelligently, and with fulsome and satisfactory advice of counsel. I cannot recall any incident in which the court has ever accepted the plea of guilty from someone who maintained that he was not guilty, and I don't intend to start today. The problem here is that if what we're going to keep going through here stands, no defendant will ever be able to revoke their guilty plea again. The judges in cases will become the executive branch. What happens here today, if this is allowed to continue, and if they charge him with perjury, is that any defendant who changes their mind and wants to revoke their plea will be subjected to perjury charges, criminal perjury charges. Judge Sullivan told After being placed under oath again, Mr. Flynn confirmed that he did not wish to challenge the circumstances. By pleading guilty, he would be giving up forever his right to challenge that interview. He knew at the time of his interview that lying to the FBI was a crime. This is all BS. And he was satisfied with the services provided by his attorneys. Mr. Flynn also disclaimed any reliance on revelations that certain FBI officials involved in the interview were being investigated for misconduct. Judge Sullivan told Mr. Flynn he could move to withdraw his guilty plea, he could take a break and confer further with his attorneys in a private room, and that he could get a second opinion from an independent court-appointed attorney on whether to withdraw his plea, despite Mr. Flynn persisted in admitting his guilt a second time under oath. this goes through what happened there. Only after these repeated offers and colloquies did Judge Sullivan accept Mr. Flynn's guilty plea to making materially false statements to the government. Consistent with his usual practice, Sullivan offered to further delay sentencing to give Flynn the full benefit of his ongoing effort to provide substantial assistance to the government. Sullivan cautioned Mr. Flynn that the sentence the court imposes today, if sentencing proceeds, may not be the sentence you would receive after your cooperation ends. As Judge Sullivan explained, it could be that at any sentence of incarceration imposed after your further cooperation is completed would be for less time than a sentence may be today. I can't make any guarantees, but I'm not hiding my disgust, my disdain for this criminal offense. To get a full understanding of the plea agreement, Judge Sullivan also asked the government whether it had to decline to prosecute Mr. Flynn for other chargeable conduct, including whether Mr. Flynn's conduct rises to the level of treasonous activity on his part. The government responded this was a serious question that it could not answer on the spot. This right here is a disgusting display of anti-American bullshit. This judge accused somebody of treason in open court, and they're pussyfooting around it because they can't fess up to it. They try to change what the judge said and kind of like massage it so that it's not as definitive as they said that it was in the courtroom. I remember the moment this happened. We're going to skip this stuff. It goes on to say how Judge Sullivan completely dismissed all of the motions for exculpatory information, all of them. And then we'll get into the arguments because it just infuriates me. It really does. It talks about his affidavit. We can go through it later. Now, in May 2020, the government contradicts its prior representations to the court and moves to dismiss. On May 7th, 2020, the government's lead prosecutor filed a notice of withdrawal. Later that day, the government filed a motion under the Federal Rule of Criminal Procedure to dismiss the information against Mr. Flynn with prejudice. After spending more than 2 years claiming that Mr. Flynn's false statements to the FBI were absolutely material, the government now claimed that any lies by Mr. Flynn in the same interview were not material. Several aspects of the government's filing are notable. First, the motion acknowledges that a Rule 48 dismissal requires leave of the court. While the government argued that the court's discretion was narrow and circumscribed, it did not argue that the court lacked discretion altogether. The motion spans 20 pages of largely factual argument supporting the request, confirming that the government was not asking the court to exercise a ministerial function. Second, the only attorney who signed the motion was Timothy Shea. Who gives? Who cares? The then acting U.S. attorney who has since left that post. The motion did not explain the absence of any line prosecutors, including those who had previously prosecuted the case, nor did it contain any declarations or affidavits from witnesses with personal knowledge supporting the government's new factual representations. Who gives a crap? That is not even arguable. They get to decide whether or not they bring a case. They don't have to prove to you why they choose not to. It is completely unprecedented what this judge is doing here. And I'm sorry that I'm fired up. Between the insurrection all across the country and this, I'm literally about to explode. Third, the motion does not mention Mr. Flynn's March 2017 false statements to the DOJ relating to his work for Turkey, which were described in the statement of offense and were relevant conduct for his guilty plea. Fourth, the government has not moved to withdraw any of its prior pleadings in the case, including its sentencing memoranda or any of the representations it previously made in open court regarding the purported materiality of Mr. Flynn's false statements. That's likely because they're moving to withdraw the case in total. How many technicalities is this a-hole going to pick out? Judge Sullivan establishes a process for deciding the government's motion. Given the absence of an adversarial briefing on the issues presented by the government's motion, Judge Sullivan exercised his inherent authority to appoint former prosecutor and retired federal district judge John Gleeson as amicus. Judge Sullivan appointed him to present arguments in opposition to the government's motion to dismiss and address whether the court should issue an order to show cause why Mr. Flynn should not be held in criminal contempt for perjury pursuant to 18 U.S.C. 401. Then they address how he had denied amicus in the past. Judge Sullivan had previously denied leave to file briefs to certain would-be interveners and amici. When Judge Sullivan issued these orders, the questions now before the district court had not arisen, and the would-be interveners and were seeking to address unrelated issues of their own choosing. Please, God, give me strength. I seriously pray. I am so angry. I really am. In a separate order, Judge Sullivan set a briefing schedule guaranteeing Mr. Flynn and the government the last word. Yeah. Minute order, May 19th. The schedule permitted additional potential amici to seek leave to weigh in on any side of the issues, and again provided Mr. Flynn and the government the right to respond. 2 days later, Mr. Flynn filed this mandamus petition. After this court ordered Judge Sullivan to file a response, the administrative office of the U.S. courts authorized him to retain counsel. To date, Judge Sullivan has not received any of the requested briefs from the parties and court-appointed amicus or made any factual findings or legal determinations in connection with the government's motion or the possibility of contempt. Throughout the proceedings below, neither party moved to recuse him nor sought a judicial reassignment. Reasons for denying the petition. Finally, 17 pages in, they're going to hopefully get to something of substance. Mandamus is a drastic and extraordinary remedy reserved for really extraordinary causes. Thank you. That's right. Mandamus is appropriate only where 1. The petitioner has no other adequate means to attain the relief he desires. They already accepted it. Judge, get over yourself. It's too late for this argument. 2. They already accepted it. I don't even understand why he's going through this. It's ridiculous. 2. The petitioner shows his right to the writ is clear and indisputable. 3, the court, in the exercise of its discretion, is satisfied that the writ is appropriate under the circumstances. Mr. Flynn cannot satisfy any of these conditions. It doesn't matter. He's replying on the case they accepted. If anybody's an attorney out there, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is a useless... They're going through here and explaining why he shouldn't have this appeals case open. He's not arguing what he was asked to argue. Hey, John Huber is here. Hey, Undercover Huber, tell me. Am I wrong? He is arguing the wrong thing. I'm going to wait a second to see what he says. If you're not following, at Undercover Huber on Twitter. Or at John W. Huber, I'm sorry, on Twitter. 1. Mr. Flynn can secure the relief he seeks without mandamus. There is no base. This doesn't matter. I mean, again, whatever. We'll go through it, but he's not arguing what they asked. There is no basis for directing the district court to grant the government's motion to dismiss before the district court has considered and decided it. Mandamus is an inappropriate vehicle for resolving a pending motion. He's scolding the court. He's scolding the court. Okay, I'm right. Thank you, UH. I appreciate you very much. I do appreciate you. You're awesome. The general principle which governs proceedings by mandamus is that whatever can be done without the employment of that extraordinary remedy may not be done with it. Mandamus is not to be used as a substitute for the regular appeals process. They're literal... Oh, Lord. Okay, let's just keep going. As Mr. Flynn appears to concede, mandamus is even more inappropriate when no rulings have been issued at all. Arguing that mandamus relief is available from a denial of the dismissal of a count or case. They're talking about what Sidney Powell argued in her petition to the court. Let me skip through here. These settled principles resolve Mr. Flynn's petition. This is not what they asked for. I can just picture now some of these judges, if they're worth their salt, are going to be really angry. Really angry. Judge Sullivan has not ruled on the government's motion to dismiss or any issues regarding contempt. If either issue is resolved unfavorably for Mr. Flynn, he can pursue review in this court. In other words, let's drag this on for another 7 months and sentence him and then let him go ahead and appeal. And if such circumstances arise, this court will be better equipped to evaluate the issues with the benefit of any determinations Judge Sullivan may make. In other words, you guys should wait. You'll be so much better off if you can see what I said. The hubris of this filing. I'm serious. Like, it's hubris. The fact that Judge Sullivan has decided nothing yet distinguishes this court's decision to grant Mandamus and Fokker. There, the district judge had rejected the government's effort to exclude time from the Speedy Trial Act clock in a deferred prosecution agreement because the prosecution had been too lenient in agreeing to and structuring it. This court granted Mandamus because that decision created immediate complications for the government. If it tried the defendant or secured a plea, a deferred prosecution would no longer be available. Because no decision has been made here, Mr. Flynn does not face any comparable harm. Who wants to list the harm that Mr. Flynn is indeed party to? Anyone? Anyone? I can list things a mile long. To the extent Mr. Flynn, who has been released on his own recognizance throughout the proceedings, claims harm from the pendency of his criminal case, that does not suffice. I.e., who gives a crap that he's been bankrupted, dragged through the mud, had his family targeted? That has no bearing on anything here. It does not suffice in proving harm to the defendant. Extraordinary writs cannot be used as substitutes for appeals, even though hardship may result from delay. Mr. Flynn likewise errs in seeking mandamus on the basis that further proceedings in the district court will subject DOJ to sustained assaults on its integrity. Judge Sullivan has not disparaged DOJ's integrity in any way. Yes, he has with this very filing. So there's that. And again, they're arguing the wrong point. And although the government has attacked the investigation of Mr. Flynn, it has not asserted any misconduct by the career prosecutors who previously oversaw the case. And to be honest, this is one time where I think the DOJ's filing fell short, because what they should have done is come clean completely instead of arguing for revocation on the flimsiest of grounds. Not really flimsy. Without going full bore and saying there was prosecutorial misconduct or anything like that. They left themselves looking glistening clean, but allowed the holes for this ridiculousness that we're going through right now. In any event, given the serious allegations in Mr. Flynn's most recent sworn statement, further proceedings in the district court will ensure the integrity of the judicial process and serve the public interest. No, it's going to serve the interest of leftist partisans and yourself. That's what it'll serve the interest of. 2, Mr. Flynn has not shown a clear and indisputable right to relief under Rule 48. I can only whistle inward. This is something else. Let's go through this one. This court, quote, cannot use mandamus to remedy anything less than a clear abuse of discretion or usurpation of judicial power. The district court's consideration of the Rule 48 motion does not approach this standard, i.e., we didn't do anything wrong. We're doing everything by the book. You're not allowed to challenge us. That's it. A, this court's precedents do not preclude Judge Sullivan's assessment of the government's motion. The government's acknowledged that district courts retain some discretion in adjudicating Rule 48 motions, for good reason. That position accords with the rule's text and history, as well as its interpretation by this court. Under Rule 48, the government must seek leave of court before dismissing an indictment or information, a command arising from the Supreme Court's guidance. Before the adoption of the Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure, judges expressed frustration that common law compelled them to grant the dismissal of an indictment, even when there was evidence that prosecutorial motives savored too much of favoritism. basically in those sentences, they're accusing the DOJ that they say they never tarnished or said anything bad about of misconduct. The version of Rule 48 submitted to the Supreme Court preserved that unqualified authority to... I'm not going to go through all the case law. Hold on. It's all precedent. Here we go. That requirement obviously vests some discretion in the district court. They use Rinaldi. This is the case that we went through in the amicus brief that was filed by the friends of the defendant, we'll say, the other day. Also, Amidon was also brought up in that decision. Anyway, in that brief, this court addressed the scope of the district's Rule 48 discretion in the context of evaluating a plea. The rule, the court explained, doesn't require the trial court to serve merely as a rubber stamp. It must be satisfied that dismissal adequately protects the public interest. So I would love to see the argument where putting General Flynn in jail for something he didn't do will serve the public interest and protect the public interest. I would love to see how usurping the executive branch's constitutionally delegated authority somehow adequately protects the public interest. Just real quick, Jaywalk on YouTube is saying 48 ain't about the DOJ, letting people off. It's about dropping and refiling cases to the detriment of the defendant, which is absolutely true. And the fact that the DOJ was looking to drop this with prejudice was the action that the DOJ took to eliminate that concern. Because if it would have just sought to withdraw without that, they could have brought it again and again and again. So by wanting to drop it with prejudice, it was trying to get around the accusation of that. So anyway, to override the government's recommendation, a trial judge must provide a reasoned exercise of discretion that advances, quote, one or more of the following components. A, fairness to the defense, such as protection against harassment. Well, now the court is harassing the defendant. B, fairness to the prosecution's interest in as avoiding a disposition that does not serve due and legitimate prosecutorial interests. C, protection of the sentencing authority reserved to the judge. The court's decision in Fokker likewise does not compel Judge Sullivan to grant the government's motions to dismiss automatically. Like Amidon, Fokker did not arise in Rule 48 context, but deferred to that rule in addressing district court's authority to reject government motions to defer time under the Speedy Trial Act. For the umpteenth time, I don't understand this, because they're basically arguing that because, in a way, they're arguing that because this case is not 100% a cookie cutter of Fokker, that Fokker's precedent doesn't really apply. And I think that that's asinine, because that's not the way precedent works. As Fokker acknowledged, the separation of powers considerations may be different once cases move past pending charges. Indeed, Fokker expressly contrasted the issue it was resolving with a court's review of a proposed plea agreement under Rule 11 of the Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure, which implicate the judiciary's traditional power over criminal sentencing. While a court cannot reject a plea because of a mere disagreement with charging decisions, i.e. decisions surrounding pleas involved markedly different considerations because they implicate the court's Article 3 function. A plea is a request for the district court to enter a judgment of conviction, which in turn carries immediate sentencing implications, which didn't happen. In other words, when the government presents a guilty plea, it asks the court to announce that there's a good faith basis to find that the defendant did what the government says he did and punish him for it, until they see that there were rogue prosecutors who hid exculpatory evidence and sat on it for years in the hopes that this would go away, and say, oh my God, what are we doing? This is horrible. The government's request for dismissal here overlaps in time with the sentencing authority reserved to the judge. They're arguing that the judge could sentence tomorrow and the DOJ is overlapping with his ability to sentence in the case, which is just... You ever see that gif where the person bashes their hand into their head or bashes their head into the desk? Just asking. Indeed, the government's motion was only possible because Judge Sullivan deferred sentencing at Mr. Flynn's request several times. Well, why did Mr. Flynn request sentencing be deferred? The first few times, the government requested that it be deferred because he was cooperating and he was a model citizen and he was an upstanding member of the community and his service to the country is unmatched and unparalleled. Remember the DOJ saying all those things under the special counsel? When he was playing ball because his attorneys were not instructing, or guiding him properly. And then it says again, the legal system benefits from allowing the district court to exercise its traditional role. Here, now this is where it gets it. We're at 27 here. There's 46 pages, but I think this is super important. The unique facts of this case raise plausible questions about the presumption of regularity afforded to prosecutorial decision-making. The record before the district court raises at least a plausible question whether the central premise of Fokker's deference to the government, the presumption of regularity that applies to prosecutorial decisions, could be overcome. While the district court may well conclude that there is insufficient basis to overcome the presumption, it serves neither the interest nor the appearance of justice to foreclose the district court from even considering that question. The relevant facts are set forth in detail above. For several years, the government represented to the district court across multiple court filings and appearances that Mr. Flynn was guilty of making materially false statements. Newsflash, they lied to you. Hey, Sullivan, they lied to you. As recently as January of this year, the government maintained those representations. And Mr. Flynn repeatedly affirmed his guilt under oath and penalty of perjury, despite being given multiple opportunities to disclaim it. Twice, not repeatedly. Twice. Not repeatedly. It was not until this year that Mr. Flynn and then the government told the district court that its finding of guilt should be reversed and that the government's prior solemn representations were legally and factually untrue. Oh my goodness! That the government filed a lengthy motion and exhibit supporting dismissal does not conclusively establish that it acted properly. So again, a few times they've said now that they're not trashing the DOJ or the Department of Justice. They're clearly doing it. They're now saying, we're also going to make a determination whether the DOJ, a co-equal branch of government, the executive, were acting properly. This judge is saying, I'm going to make a decision on whether or not this should be allowed, even though you found factual and where was it? Anyway, I was looking for their own words, but you get the point. The length of the government's motion suggests that its reversal was not an everyday occurrence. It's not. The circumstances of that filing are also unusual. It was signed by an acting U.S. attorney alone with no line prosecutors joining it. Is there a mandatory requirement that line attorneys sign on to anything that the DOJ files? No, there's not. It featured no affidavits or declarations supporting its many new factual allegations. That's because it contained the very documents to support their factual allegations. You don't need an affidavit when you have literally handwritten documents that say, what is our goal? To get him to lie? You have their own words. You don't need an affidavit or declaration. You have their own words right in front of you on paper. They're handwriting, for goodness sakes, with a pen, not even typed. Why the hell would you need an affidavit? It was not accompanied by a motion to vacate the government's prior contrary filings and representations. I would argue that this was an oversight. I don't think that there was anything other than an oversight on this issue. It cited minimal legal authority in support of its view on materiality. No, It didn't. It cited exactly what it needed to. Here's why this wasn't material. The people handling this case before made a huge mistake. Oh my gosh, we're going to send an innocent man to jail. We don't want to do this. End of story. And it did not mention the March 2017 statements regarding Mr. Flynn's work for Turkey that were relevant conduct for his guilty plea and included in a statement of defense, but were unrelated to the interview. Whether these circumstances could constitute clear evidence overcoming the presumption of regularity is a question that has not been fully briefed or decided in the district court. And it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be. A finding that the government's later efforts to terminate the prosecution were tainted with impropriety cannot and should not be lightly made. In other words, they're accusing the DOJ of impropriety. The people that say that this judge has never talked poorly about the DOJ are now accusing the DOJ of impropriety in withdrawing a case. For now, it suffices to say that the unusual developments in this case provide at least a plausible reason to question the bona fides of the government's motion. They're questioning the truthfulness of the government's motion that is backed up by exhibits written by the very people that set the man up. Did he even read it? Did he even read it? Did he even read the motion to withdraw? He doesn't, their own words, their own text messages, they're in there. Now, again, they're arguing why Mandamus is not warranted. They're not arguing why they shouldn't dismiss the case. They have a weak-ass, ridiculous argument that goes on for 3 pages about what the judges asked him to do. And now they're going on to talk about why this court shouldn't be deciding it. When you focus all of your attention on something that's not required of you in the legal world. For example, Judge Sullivan, just to give you a parallel, Judge Sullivan is doing here what he scolded Sidney Powell for doing. Sidney Powell filed motion for 53 different pieces of exculpatory information. Judge Sullivan spent 90 pages scolding Sidney Powell about how those things were irrelevant to the case. Now, Judge Sullivan himself is arguing things that are irrelevant to what he's asked to argue. Do you see how that works? Judge Sullivan has adopted a sensible process for evaluating the substantial questions presented here. No, it's not sensible. It's hiring somebody who literally a week prior wrote a partisan op-ed excoriating General Flynn to come in and decide the fate of General Flynn? Seriously? I know I'm a little bit loud today, but what is happening in this country? The government and Mr. Flynn currently are aligned in support of dismissal, with nobody presenting the other side of the complex and important Rule 48 questions raised by the request. There is no other side. Because the court cannot be an advocate, meaning they can't do it themselves, someone else must fill the void created by this breakdown in the process. There is no principled reason to preclude district courts from doing the same. Indeed, district courts have appointed and invited in other criminal cases. In this district alone, numerous judges have engaged in the practice. Even a cursory review shows that other courts have done it. Contrary to Mr. Flynn's suggestion, the local rules do not bar this practice. The district court's civil rules govern all proceedings and allow for the participation of Amicus curiae. Then the Supreme Court's recent decision there is also no merit to Mr. Flynn's implication that the district court's appointment of retired Judge Gleeson suggests he will rule against Mr. Flynn. I beg to differ. Someone needs to fill the adversarial gap to ensure full consideration of the issues, and a former prosecutor and federal judge is well positioned to do so. In any event, Judge Sullivan's record shows that he will not blindly accept Judge Gleeson's recommendations. In a criminal case before Judge Sullivan, the government and the defendants were aligned in support of DPA, and no one was taking the other side. Judge Sullivan appointed an amicus known for his skepticism of DPA to address the district court's role and rejected the too broad arguments and ultimately agreeing with the government and defendant. Then they're again arguing why mandamus should be denied. Denying mandamus also makes sense because it would allow this court to consider all the legal issues presented by this case at once rather than piecemeal if such consideration is even necessary. Regardless how this court resolves the Rule 48 issue, questions remain whether Mr. Flynn should be subject to any sanction pursuant to statute, the federal rules, and federal courts' inherent authority to discipline those who fail to tell the truth under oath and obstruct justice in the courtroom. He didn't obstruct justice. That's the biggest problem. They have no argument on obstruction of justice. They go through the contempt power here, which is probably a really interesting argument to make. To be clear, a contempt finding or sanction against Mr. Flynn may prove unwarranted. If the representations in his 2020 declaration are true, they present attenuating circumstances for his prior contrary statements. But the nature and extent of Mr. Flynn's reversals under oath, from whether he lied to the government in January and March 2017, to whether he was coerced into pleading guilty, misled by his former attorneys, or improperly dissuaded from withdrawing his guilty plea in 2018 when Judge Sullivan offered that option, raise questions that any judge should take seriously. They thus provide a basis for invoking the district court's authority to conduct investigations as necessary. Now, the judge is saying they're going to investigate. Week after week, this court addresses all manner of legal questions aided by fact-finding and legal analysis from the able district judges in this circuit. In this unusual case, one of those long-tenured judges appointed an amicus to enhance his ability to perform those precise tasks in the near future. Because our judicial system is premised on the notion that adversarial presentation of the issues leads to better decisions. Hold on. The court should holster the potent weapon of mandamus and allow Judge Sullivan to evaluate the government's motion to dismiss in the first instance. This petition should be denied. They completely missed the boat. They missed the point. Completely missed the point. This whole brief missed the point. It does not follow any of the standard. It does not follow what the judge was instructed to do. I'm going to refresh this real quick. I'm just looking here to see. Oh, we got a government response, I believe. Yep, here it is. Okay, so here we are. We just, the United States, the DOJ has just filed their brief in this case. I'm going to read it for the first time right now with you live. The Constitution vests in the executive branch the power to decide when and when not to prosecute potential crimes. Exercising that Article 2 power here, the executive filed a motion to dismiss the indictment and the petitioner consented. Despite that exercise of prosecutorial discretion and the lack of any remaining Article 3 controversy between the parties, the district court failed to grant the motion and bring the case to a close, and instead appointed an amicus curiae to argue against dismissal and to consider additional criminal charges. Before I continue, I just want to make sure that everybody's on board here. Do you want me to read through this live with you guys now, or do you want me to put a pause on this video and do it at another time? Number 1 for keep going, number 2 for stop. Sorry. Okay. Off we go, friends. Suit up. We're going in. This court should issue a writ of mandamus compelling dismissal. Federal Rule of Criminal Procedure 48 provides that the government may, with leave of court, dismiss an indictment. That language does not authorize a court to stand in the way of a dismissal the defendant does not oppose, and any other reading of the rule would violate both Article 2 and Article 3. Nor, under the circumstances of this case, may the district court assume the role of prosecutor and initiate criminal charges of its own. Instead of inviting further proceedings, the court should have granted the government's motion to dismiss, and given the court's infringement on the executive's performance of its constitutional duties, a writ of mandamus is appropriate, as this court held in similar circumstances. Petitioner factual background. Here we go. We might get something new in here. Who knows? Factual background. Petitioner Michael Flynn served as a surrogate and advisor for then-candidate Donald J. Trump during the 2016 presidential campaign. In 2016, the FBI began investigating Petitioner as part of a larger investigation into whether individuals associated with President Trump's campaign were coordinating with the Russian government to interfere with the election. After several months, the FBI identified no derogatory information about Petitioner and determined that he was no longer a viable candidate for investigation. In early January 2017, the FBI stated in a draft internal memorandum that it was, quote, closing its investigation of Petitioner. Around the same time, the FBI learned that Petitioner and Sergei Kislyak, then Russia's ambassador to the United States, had spoken by telephone in late December, around the time that President Obama announced sanctions against Russia for election interference. The FBI later prepared transcripts of the relevant calls. When they spoke, Petitioner asked Kislyak not to escalate tensions in response to the sanctions, and Kislyak later confirmed that Russia had taken the incoming administration's position into account in determining its response. FBI personnel considered whether Petitioner had violated the Logan Act, which prohibits U.S. citizens from trying to influence foreign governments in disputes with the United States. But that idea got little traction within the Department of Justice because there's never been a conviction under the Logan Act in its 200-year history. And regardless, communications by an incoming administration with foreign officials are not necessarily out of the ordinary. This is just again, let me clear off. This is the government responding. The appellate court, I always say that wrong. The appellate court invited the DOJ to file also if they so choose. Do you see the difference in these two already? On January 4th, 2017, Peter Strzok, then FBI Deputy Assistant Director, learned that Petitioner's file serendipitously had been left open. Strzok instructed agents to keep the investigation open for now. In electronic messages, Strzok and Lisa Page, then an FBI attorney, expressed relief and commented that the FBI's utter incompetence in failing to timely close the file was actually helping them. Approximately a week later, a news report indicated that Petitioner and Kislyak had spoken on the day Russian sanctions were announced. A spokesperson for the president-elect responded that the petitioner's calls focused on logistics. 2 days later, the vice president-elect stated in a public news interview that he had spoken to Petitioner and that Petitioner's conversations with Kislyak did not relate to sanctions. FBI Director James Comey took the view that the FBI should not notify the incoming administration about the content of the conversations between Petitioner and Kislyak. The acting attorney general, the director of national intelligence, and the director of the CIA disagreed, but the latter two ultimately backed off. On January 22, 2017, following the president's inauguration, Petitioner was sworn in as National Security Advisor. The next day, Comey directed two, quote, experienced FBI agents to interview Petitioner. Comey resolved that neither the White House counsel nor anyone at the Justice Department would be notified in advance of the interview. On the day of the interview, the acting attorney general decided, quote, enough was enough, and called Comey to tell him that it was time to notify the White House about the substance of the petitioner's calls. When Comey returned the call, he told her that two agents were already on the way to interview Petitioner. The acting attorney general and others at the department were flabbergasted that the FBI had decided to proceed without coordinating with the department. Before the interview, FBI officials discussed whether to show Petitioner the text of the relevant calls. In notes made to prepare for the discussion, FBI Chief of Counterintelligence E.W. Precedent took the view that the FBI should rethink its decision not to show Petitioner the text. Precedent's notes observed that the FBI regularly showed subjects evidence with the goal of getting them to admit their wrongdoing. Excuse me. In his notes, Precedent questioned whether the FBI's goal was getting the truth, admission, or getting Petitioner to lie so we can prosecute him or get him fired. FBI leadership ultimately decided not to show Petitioner the text. In other words, to show Petitioner the transcripts of his calls with Kislyak. FBI, they also decided not to warn Petitioner that lying to the FBI is a crime. FBI Deputy Director Andrew McCabe spoke by phone to Petitioner. asking to have two agents sit down with him to hear about his conversations with Kislyak. Petitioner noted that the FBI likely knew what he was said in the calls because it listens to everything the Russians say. McCabe indicated that he nevertheless wanted the interview to be done as quickly, quietly, and discreetly as possible. Petitioner agreed to meet alone with the agents the same day without involving the White House counsel's office. Less than 2 hours later, Petitioner met with Strzok and a second agent at the White House. Petitioner was, quote, relaxed, unguarded, and talkative. He clearly saw the FBI agents as allies. The agents did not record the interview but took handwritten notes. After returning to the FBI, the agents drafted a 302, summarizing the interview, and they continued to revise it thereafter. According to the final 302, when the agents asked Petitioner whether he recalled any conversation with Kislyak in which he encouraged Kislyak not to, quote, escalate the situation in response to the sanctions, Petitioner responded, not really. I don't remember. It wasn't don't do anything. According to the FD 302, the agents asked Petitioner whether he recalled the conversation in which Kislyak stated that Russia had taken the incoming administration's position into account when responding to the sanctions. Petitioner stated that he didn't recall such a conversation. The agents' handwritten notes do not reflect that question being asked or Petitioner's response. Interesting. The final FD 302 also reports that Petitioner incorrectly stated that in earlier calls with Kislyak, Petitioner had not made any request about voting on a UN resolution in a certain manner or slowing down the vote. Petitioner indicated that the conversation, which took place on a day when he was calling many other countries, was, quote, along the lines of, where do you stand and what's your position? The final FD 302 also states that Petitioner was asked whether Kislyak described any Russian response to his request and said that Kislyak had not, although the agent's handwritten notes do not reflect Petitioner being asked that question or giving that response. In other words, their 302s are faulty. After the interview, the agents agreed that Petitioner didn't give any indicators of deception. Both agents had the impression that Petitioner was not lying or didn't think he was lying. In their view, it was possible that Petitioner really didn't remember the substance of his calls. Comey later described the two experienced agents, reporting that they saw nothing that indicated to them that he knew he was lying to them. When Comey was asked on March 2nd, 2017, whether he believed that the petitioner lied, he responded, I don't know. I think there's an argument to be made that he lied. It's a close one. Soon after the interview, Precedent, Strzok, and other senior FBI officials briefed individuals at the department. When the department raised the issue of re-interviewing Petitioner, the FBI was pretty emphatic that a re-interview was unnecessary. Department officials briefed the White House, and the department arranged to provide transcripts of Petitioner's calls. An internal department memorandum indicates that by late January 2017, the FBI advised the department that it did not believe that Petitioner was acting as a Russian agent. The president asked for Petitioner's resignation on February 13th. Thereafter, new information emerged about essential participants in the investigation. Strzok was removed due to apparent political bias and was terminated from the FBI. The second interviewing agent was criticized by the Inspector General for his tactics in connection with the larger investigation. And McCabe was terminated after the DOJ determined that he lied under oath, including to FBI agents. And then they cite procedural background. This is getting interesting. I'm just reading this right now. I don't know if everybody likes that or not, but here we are. On November 30th, 2017, the special counsel's office filed a criminal information charging Petitioner with a single count of making false statements in violation of 18 U.S.C. 1001. The next day, Petitioner pled guilty to that offense before Rudolph Contreras. The statement of offense provided that Petitioner, quote, made materially false statements and omissions that impeded and otherwise had a material impact on the FBI's ongoing investigation into the existence of any links or coordination between individuals associated with the Trump campaign and Russia's efforts to interfere with the election. The case was subsequently reassigned to the Honorable Emmett G. Sullivan. The district court set a sentencing hearing for December 18th. In pre-sentencing filings, the government agreed that Petitioner had substantially cooperated and that a probation-only sentence could be appropriate. At the outset of the hearing, the court informed Petitioner that it would conduct an extension of the plea colloquy. The court asked Petitioner to reaffirm his plea under oath. On the advice of counsel, Petitioner maintained his guilty plea and indicated he was ready to proceed to sentencing. The district court then addressed Petitioner, stating that his offense arguably undermines everything this flag over here stands for. Arguably, you sold your country out. The court stated that it was, quote, not hiding its disgust, its disdain for this criminal offense. The court suggested that petitioner consider delaying the sentencing until after his cooperation was complete. After conferring with counsel, petitioner requested a continuance. Petitioner subsequently retained new counsel. He then filed a Brady motion, which the district court denied. In January 2020, petitioner moved to withdraw his guilty plea, asserting ineffective assistance of prior counsel. Petitioner also filed a motion to dismiss the case for government misconduct. On May 7th, 2020, while those motions remained pending, the government moved to dismiss the case under Federal Rule of Criminal Procedure 48. The government first explained a court's narrow role in addressing a Rule 48 motion. The government then set out its reasons for the dismissal, explaining why it had concluded that continued prosecution would not serve the interest of justice. Petitioner consented. A few days later, retired federal judge John Gleeson co-authored an article urging the district court to scrutinize the government's motion, including by appointing an independent attorney to act as a friend of the court and provide for an adversarial inquiry. On May 13, 2020, the court appointed Judge Gleeson as Amicus curiae to present arguments in opposition to the government's motion to dismiss. It also directed Amicus to address whether the court should issue an order to show cause why petitioner should not be held in criminal contempt for perjury. Court-appointed Amicus then indicated that he intends to inform the court about any additional factual development Amicus may need before finalizing his argument in opposition to the government's motion. The district court subsequently set a briefing schedule on the government's Rule 48 motion, providing for multiple briefs submitted by the court-appointed Amicus, the government, and petitioner, as well as additional briefs from non-court-appointed amici, with oral arguments scheduled for July 16th, 2020. The All Writs Act empowers courts of appeals to issue writs of mandamus. In reviewing a petition, the threshold question is whether the district court's ruling constitutes a legal error. The remaining question is whether the error is the kind that justifies mandamus. The answers to those questions are plain under United States v. Fokker. In Fokker, the court issued a writ of mandamus to compel a district court to grant an unopposed motion to terminate a prosecution in order to avoid an unwarranted impairment of another branch in the performance of its constitutional duties. The court should do the same here for the same reason. Under Articles 2 and 3 of the Constitution, the power to prosecute belongs to the executive, not the judiciary. Federal Criminal Rule 48, read against the backdrop of that constitutional principle, required the district court to grant the government's motion to dismiss the indictment with prejudice because the motion was unopposed. At a minimum, it required the court to grant the motion under the circumstances of this case, notwithstanding the guilty plea. Then they say the Constitution commits the power to prosecute to the executive rather than the judiciary. As a general matter, the executive branch has exclusive authority and absolute discretion to decide whether to prosecute a case. This court has likewise recognized that the power to decide when to investigate and when to prosecute lies at the core of the executive's duty to see the faithful execution of the laws. A corollary of the executive's exclusive authority is that neither the judicial nor legislative branches may directly interfere with the prosecutorial discretion of the executive by directing the executive to prosecute particular individuals. I don't have much to say because this is all pretty solid. For example, in light of the executive power over prosecutions, the remedy for a selective prosecution based on impermissible considerations is to dismiss the prosecution, not to compel the executive to bring another one. Article 3 provides the federal courts may exercise only judicial power over cases and controversies. For instance, if all parties to a civil case agree the case should be dismissed, the stipulated dismissal resolves all claims before the court and leaves the court without a live Article 3 case or controversy. I love this because they're using the civil rules to demonstrate to the court who says that they are ruled by the civil rules. Do you guys understand what I'm saying? The motion was unopposed, so Rule 48 requires the government, the judge to dismiss. They cite Rinaldi. There are like 3 or 4 different cases that are coming up over and over in here. A Judicial Watch case is cited here. I'm just reading real quick because my voice is starting to hurt. Nor may a court deny leave on the ground that the prosecution has failed to redress the gravity of the defendant's alleged conduct. In other words, it doesn't really matter what the defendant did. It is not the authority of the court to assert the gravity of what the defendant did in determining whether or not they're going to be accepting the dismissal. Hold on. The Constitution does not place judicially enforceable limits on the powers of the non-judicial branches of government. For example, the government may not make its prosecutorial decisions on racially discriminatory grounds, but they are the limits found in the Constitution and thus do not include bad faith and against the public interest. How does a voice hurt? Somebody's asking. Well, when you talk for about an hour and a half, and then you talked for about 2 hours earlier in the day, and a lot of it is at a volume which is uncomfortable for one's vocal cords, you start to get a sore throat. Happens to me a lot, actually. And I used to be a singer, so it's really weird, but it happens. In addition, the dicta rests on an unsound premise that when the executive decides no longer to prosecute a case, district courts have freewheeling and standardless authority to prevent what they regard as abuse of that prosecutorial discretion. At a minimum, Rule 48 required the district court to grant the motion to dismiss. In its motion, the government first explained that after an extensive review and careful consideration, it determined that the continued prosecution of the case would not serve the interest of justice. It explained that record materials could be taken to suggest the FBI was eager to interview petitioner irrespective of any underlying investigation, and that the interview was undertaken predominantly to elicit those very false statements and thereby criminalize him. The executive branch is entitled to determine that based on the circumstances surrounding the interview, it can no longer make the policy judgment that continued prosecution serves a substantial federal interest. It also doesn't believe that it can prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. Even though he previously pled guilty, it is Justice Department policy that prosecutions should not be initiated and not continued unless the attorney for the government believes that the admissible evidence is sufficient to obtain and sustain a guilty verdict. Also, the government was concerned it wouldn't be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that petitioner willfully made false statements. The government determined that the foundational evidence of willful falsity would have had major weaknesses at trial in light of the interviewing agent's own doubts about whether petitioner was lying, the equivocal nature of some of the critical statements in his interview, and substantial impeaching material for a key witness. And just as in Rinaldi, where the district court was required to grant a post-conviction motion, simply put, the district court has no authority to reject the executive's conclusion that those reasons justify a dismissal. The government's detailed explanation is far more than a mere conclusory statement, amply satisfying any procedural requirement that the government provide reasons for its decision to end a prosecution. There is also no evidence at all, much less of the kind of clear evidence needed to overcome the presumption of regularity, that the prosecutors were motivated by bribery or similar considerations. Because this case involves the prosecution's constitutionally rooted exercise of charging discretion, it is an usurpation of judicial power to second-guess it. The timing of the government's motion cannot justify denying it. They've argued, the other friends of the court briefs have argued that the district court may deny the motion to dismiss because the government filed it after the petitioner had pled guilty. But nothing in the text of Rule 48 suggests the executive's authority to obtain dismissal expires or shrinks upon the entry of a guilty plea. Quite the contrary. It's well established the government may move to dismiss even after a complaint has turned into a conviction. It's happened before, plenty of times. They argue that under Plout v. Spendthrift Farm, the executive has no power to command the federal courts to reopen final judgments. But judgment in a criminal case means sentence. And a judgment becomes final for purposes of the separation of powers only after all appeals have been foregone or completed. Here, the district court has not yet pronounced sentence, so there is not even a judgment, much less one that has become final after the exhaustion of appeals. Far from authorizing further proceedings at the district court's behest, the Constitution requires the court to honor the executive's unopposed decision to drop the pending charges and precludes the case from proceeding to sentencing in the absence of a live controversy. They also argue that dismissal would interfere with the district court's authority to decide what sentence to impose. But a district court lacks the authority to impose a criminal sentence after an unopposed motion to dismiss with prejudice, just as it lacks the authority in a civil case to award damages after the plaintiff moves to dismiss. The district court erred when, instead of granting the motion, it entered an order appointing an amicus curiae and contemplating its own prosecution. The court's effort to pursue additional charges compound the error. False statements in a plea colloquy, or motion to withdraw are not contempt under the statute. Congress enacted the Act of March 2nd, 1831, to drastically curtail the range of conduct which courts could punish as contempt. The current contempt statute is based on the act passed in 1831. 401 provides in pertinent part that a court of the United States shall have the power to punish by fine or imprisonment such contempt of its authority as misbehavior of any person in its presence or so near thereto as to obstruct the administration of justice. Obstruction is an element that must clearly be shown in every case where the power to punish for contempt is exerted. Absent any evidence to warrant a finding of actual obstruction of the administration of justice, there can be no violation. In the context of Section 401, the Supreme Court has construed the term obstruction narrowly, quote, against the background rule that the contempt power was to be confined to the least possible power adequate to protect the administration of justice against immediate interruption of his business. Otherwise, They mean when people are in the court making a scene and a ruckus and obstructing the business of the court in that very moment. They don't mean when somebody may say something that is untrue. Petitioner pled guilty to making false statements to the FBI, but later moved to withdraw his plea, asserting his innocence. The suggestion of perjury is apparently based on statements petitioner made either in pleading guilty or moving to withdraw. Even assuming petitioner committed perjury, however, he can't be prosecuted for contempt because perjury in itself does not satisfy obstruction or intent. That is not to say perjury must go unpunished. There's a separate federal criminal statute enforced by the executive prohibiting perjury. It can also warrant an increased sentence, but perjury without more simply is not a criminal contempt under Section 401. And they go on to argue why he can't be charged with contempt. Even here, this is a good one. Even if the petitioner committed criminal contempt, the authority to prosecute him would lie with the U.S. attorney, not the district court. As explained above, to the extent the courts may exercise such power, it is only as part of the judicial function. Even if petitioner committed criminal contempt, the district court could initiate its own prosecution of him only if doing so were a valid exercise of the judicial power. Such a prosecution would not be a valid exercise. The judicial power authorizes the court to initiate criminal contempt proceedings and to appoint a private attorney to prosecute it only when necessary to vindicate its own authority without complete dependence on other branches. This case doesn't fall within that narrow exception. Even if the conduct constituted contempt, prosecuting that would not be necessary to allow the district court to function. Writ of mandamus is appropriate and necessary. Hold on. I'm reading. Hold on. Conclusion. There we go. This court should issue a writ of mandamus directing the district court to grant the government's motion to dismiss the indictment. Let's see what, if anything, people are saying on Twitter and then we will go for the day.
Mr. Bartles, do you have anything to say about what happened on Saturday?
Anything you want to say about
Anything?
it?
Anything you want to
Why
say?
did you destroy that police car?
Just go. Do you have anything to say?
Wow. Oh, we've got an undercover Hoover thread. I love him. He's great. Okay, guys. If you appreciate the work I do and you'd like to become a patron, I would be honored to have you. You can find me on Patreon at patreon.com/TracyBeans with a Z. You can find me on Subscribestar as well, or paypal.me/TracyBeans. What comes next? We hear from the court and see what they have to say. In addition, pray for our country. Stand arm in arm, united with one another against this absolute disgusting insurgency that we're seeing across the country. And we're going to get through this together. But it's the last gasps of a desperate evil machine. Sorry if it got a little bit monotonous towards the end, but I wanted to get all the stuff out on the record and go through it with you. Thank you for listening. We'll talk to you